Okay, welcome back. In this unit 2.6, we'll talk about data integrity checks. This is specific to chapter 6 from the assigned book. In the previous unit 2.5, we talked about dirty data. We talked about what makes data dirty and the fact that there are errors everywhere. Now, the question is, we'll talk in this particular thing, we'll specifically talk about what kind of checks you can run um, to evaluate the data. And in the next unit, which is 2.7, we'll talk about what can you do to shape your data, to clean the data. So let's talk about data integrity checks in this unit first. Okay, so in this particular unit, data integrity checks, first we'll talk about some basics of data integrity. Then we'll talk about how to do big picture checks, followed by talking about some detailed integrity checks. Then you'll have an optional practice exercise. Um, so let's move on. Okay, coming to the introduction, what is a data integrity check and why do you do it? Well, we do data integrity checks to see how bad the data is. Is this so bad that you can't run the analysis, you can't change or clean it, then you'll probably have to find a different data set to answer your question. So the very core of doing data check is to determine the condition of the data set. Now, what is data integrity check then? It's a systematic method of examining the problems in the data. And first, we'll talk about the big picture data integrity check. We'll look at the data itself at a very general level. Then we'll talk about more specific data integrity check specific to each of the columns. Um, Now, mainly we'll use Excel, and the Excel files that you will need for this particular unit are available in this link. You can go to this link and download the data sets. And and the specific data set that we will talk about in the next slide would be this particular data set, and you can find this um, uh, the data documentation specific to that data set. And I'll give you more details about where to find this and all those things in the next video, basically. Uh, Now, what I'll do in the next video is, before I show you what I do in the next video, I just wanted to quickly remind you about the best practices that you learn in Unit 1, where once you download the data, you also need to download the data documentation file. And we said the data documentation file is that file that has information about the basics of the data, like how many columns are there, and what is the name of each of the column, and the description of that column, and how many rows there are. So that data documentation file, you'll find it um, in the same database or the data page that you're downloading your data from, and you have to just search through. It comes in different names. It's called data documentation in some places. Sometimes it's also called metadata. Sometimes it's called record layout or code book, or may have some or other names. But the bottom line is this data documentation should have information about the data itself. Now, um, uh, in addition to that, one of the best practices that we discussed in Unit 1 was about creating a data book. It's like just a text file. Um, for you, remember in one of the videos in Unit 1, I showed you to use the text file, and I use the text Wrangler, but you could use a Notepad++ if you use Windows. In either of those cases, what you're basically doing is keeping a record of the work you're doing after you download. Like, where did you download it from? What is the name of the data? How many rows it has? What is the specific link? And do you have a documentation and like the format in which it is? It is usually in the PDF or Word document. So you keep a record of all this information so that moving forward, when you have this data and working on this data, you can refer to this data book and get your answers right away, as opposed to researching for information all over again. So let's look at a quick video on how to run these data checks. Um, Even before the video, first I'll talk about the general big picture data checks in the next slide before the video specific to it. Following that, there will be a description of what uh, a specific detailed data check is, followed by a video specific to that. So just to let you know and give you a big picture. Okay, so in the next slide, we'll talk about the big picture data check or the data integrity check. What it basically means is you're looking at data errors by just looking at the data as a whole, as opposed to specific columns. So let's look at the data big picture data check in the next slide. Okay, so the big picture data check is very simple. You basically try to answer such questions as, okay, what is the format of the file? Is it a CSV file or Excel file? You try to find out the format of the file first. Now, mostly we'll be working on Excel, but so knowing the actual format and keeping a record of it is important. Then you look at the number of rows there are, um, and the number of columns there are, and whether there is a header uh, for these columns, which will give you the name of the column. Um, and you try to see match this with the data documentation you have for this data set and see if there is a match and is all the information accurately presented and so on and so forth. You'll do it for the entire data set at a general level. And in the following detailed check, you will do the data check or the integrity check for each column one at a time. So let's look at a video, quick video that will demonstrate and show you how to do this big picture data check in the next short video. Okay, so we're talking about general data integrity test. It's pretty simple. Um, Now, first thing is I want you to show you where I'm downloading this data from. And the textbook talks about it, and the PowerPoint presentation or the PDF that is attached to the lecture also has the link to it. Basically, you go to this particular link and you download from this chapter this particular data file. So I'm going to show you. So I'm downloading the data file here. I'm going to go to the location of the data file. Then I'm going to open it with Excel. And here it is, right? Now, one thing before we move on to working on this data that I want you to show you is the best practices. Remember, whenever you're working with data, you've downloaded this data, right? So make sure you use this template I talked about before, like the data you're downloading it, the name of the data, the URL, and why you're collecting this data, what do you plan to do with it, and information about the number of rows and columns and source. And this information you usually find the data documentation. And the data documentation for this particular data file can be gathered from this particular link. Again, this link will take you to this data documentation file. This data documentation file on this particular site is called metadata. It gives information about number of columns, rows, and so on and so forth. Okay, now what do you do now? Well, you need to click on the cell right here, and depending on its Windows or um, Mac, you basically click on Command and End button to go to the specific cell. And oops. So it went to the last cell saying that there are Z 26 number of columns, which again matches with the uh, data documentation file. And the data documentation file gives you information about the meaning of each of those columns. Then the other thing is how many rows there are. And you can do the same thing by moving on to, um, again, different keyboards have different options. I'm going to just command and down because my keyboard is not um, most advanced one. So I'm going to just go um, till I find the last row, right? And if you see, the last row is pretty much, let's do this. Okay, so last row is specific to 8023, which again matches with the description of it. So you're looking at number of rows and number of columns, and the number of rows you have are 8023. As you can see here, can you see that? 8023. And number of columns is 26, so it matches it. So it's as simple as that. You basically make a record of this, download the data. First, you try to see whether the data format that the file has a format of Excel. The second thing you look at is the number of columns and number of rows. So what I'll do in the following slide and the video that follows those slides, we'll talk about detailed data integrity check. Okay, so now that we know how to do a big picture data check, now it is the time to know how to do individual detailed checks specific to each of the columns. And there are specific things that you need to do for each of the columns. And once you do it, you keep repeating it for each of those columns to determine the integrity, if there are any errors or not. So let's move on to that slide. And that slide, in that slide, I'll give a brief description of the checks that you will do under this category. And following that, you'll see a short video that will demonstrate how to do that for you. So coming to the detailed data check, you basically take the data set, and in the big picture one, you looked at the integrity of the entire data set. Here, you'll actually do the check for individual columns. And in doing this, what you basically do is for each selected column, you generate a pivot table. A pivot table is like a summary table of the information specific to each column. And you'll repeat that for each column till you're done doing it for all the columns there are in the data set. And in this pivot table, which is a summary table, once you run it, which you'll learn how to do it in the next slide in a short video, is it will give you information about all the data values there are. Different, like if it is like, okay, the data has information about cities, so it will list all the cities, names of all the cities. Then it will give you frequencies, so like how many data points are related to this particular city, how many data points are related to this particular city. To give you more example, let's say you're looking at the column that says um, contributions for campaign elections, campaign and you have who has contributed to it, and one of the columns gives information about the city where it is coming from. So you may have like 100 contributions made and from different cities, and when you run this pivot, the pivot table, when you generate this pivot table, it will list, because there will be many contributions from a single city, right? So there will be 3 people from one city, maybe 10 people from other city. What this data pivot table does is it will list all different cities the candidate received the campaign contributions from. Then it will say how many contributions you received from each city. So that's what it means, listing the number of data values, that is the city, and then giving a frequency for the values. In other words, how many, the raw count, how many contributions for each city. So I'll give you more details about how to do it within a short video in the next slide. But download this particular PDF file and also download the data file that you'll need to work on this, which I will also show in the video anyways. So let's move on. Okay, so again, everything's same. We're going to use the same data set that we used for the general integrity test. Now we're going to do the detailed integrity check. So this is the information, and according to the data file, we know that there are 25 candidates. When I say data file, I'm referring to the data documentation file, which was in Excel format. There are 25 candidate specific committees, right? And and then you have the unique ID, um, a unique ID that is, I think, 8 digit, if I remember correctly. Um, then each have the and each committee spends some amount, and that's what the contributions are. And we also can figure out from the data documentation that every expenditure by each candidates committee um, was reported only if the value was greater than $200. So if it's less than $200, it's not reported in the expenditure. So that's another thing keep in mind. Okay, now that we know these basics, now the thing is to actually do the data um, integrity check in a detailed fashion. Now this is very simple. You actually create pivot tables for each of the columns individually. So what the pivot table does is it creates for a given column how many unique values are there. In this case, it's the committee ID, right? So how many unique committee IDs are here? Keep in mind, it shouldn't be more than 25, right? Because we know that there are only 25 candidates, so 25 committees. And each committee is given a number, right? So there shouldn't be more than 25. And we can see like how many times each of these unique IDs uh, uh, um, are represented here. So number of unique IDs, then how often are these represented? Because there are 8,022 observations, right? So which committee is spending more would that's what it means. So now it's very simple. You need to use the insert button. And if you're using a Mac, please don't use the insert button at the top, but actually within the file, there is an insert button. Then click on the pivot table. Make sure when you do that, okay, I'm gonna actually cancel this. But before you do that, I selected this column, right? Don't do that. Make sure you just select a column, a cell, anywhere. Then click on the pivot table. Okay, it automatically will select the first row, um, and then it assumes that it will assume that it has the data header. This is called the header. Um, and first row of each data sheet is a header, which means that it represents the name of each column. So first column is for column name, second one ID, third one, fourth one, so on and so forth. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, now what it does is it creates a new sheet. So it took you from here to a new sheet, and this new sheet has this pivot table now. Now this is what will be generated once you work through these things. On the right side, in the field name, you can clearly see that there is column ID, right? And if you move that column ID to the rows, okay, then you can see the column ID lists the unique number of times um, the IDs are represented, how many unique IDs are there. Then we also want to know the frequency for each. How often did each unique ID appear in the next column? So we need to pull or move this ID to the values. Now, this has generated that this particular ID occurred 22 times. Okay, this is smart. So you know that the Excel is smart, so it knows that the ID is a text file. So it's not calculating some average because these are not numbers, right? So what it is doing is trying to calculate the frequency, the raw count of how many times each unit occurred. So this particular occurred 22 times. This particular thing occurred 993 times for a total of 8,022, which is again matches with the documentation where there are 8,022 observations, of which um, this particular committee received the least. Now let's see how many committee IDs are listed here. Now one, two, it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Well, there are 25 candidates, but there are only 17 committees that reported their expenditure. What does it mean? Well, it's probably because the remaining 8 they did not report, because remember the documentation said that they only need to report if the expenditure is above $200. Okay, so and you do the same for each of the columns one at a time, and that would be the end of the detailed data check. Um, um, so that's that. Okay, now that you know some basics of data integrity checks, and you also know how to do the big picture data checks and how you to do the detailed data checks. Now, in the next slide, I'll quickly provide you information about an optional uh, practice exercise. Okay, coming to the optional practice exercise, you'll need to download a copy of the 2014 uh, disbursements file um, for the US Senate candidates in your state, which I'm guessing is Indiana, from the FEC data portal from this particular website. Once you download it, you need to run the integrity checks. Then you need to keep notes in your data notebook, and then answer this question: what problems do you see when you run these checks? And how would these problems impede or impair running analysis on this? I know we didn't talk about the analysis here. Just think about like what the results are of the data integrity checks from the data that you have downloaded from this site. Okay, good luck. In the next unit, we'll talk about how to clean the data. Uh, Once you run the integrity checks, which will show you the problems with the data, the next thing you'll do is clean it up so you can analyze it.